Good afternoon, everyone, including the PMC and the PMEA members and our marketing partners. Welcome to the 13th of our PMC series of webinars. My name's Kevin, and I hope that you all have an enjoyable and informative day with us today. Just before I get going, I'd like to mention and thank our valued marketing partners, for without these companies' assistance, the webinars would not be possible. Our supporting partners are Major Drilling, Leader Technologies, Hexagon Mining, Mezzo Autotech, Index, Cruz Marcelo Attack Francia, First Metro Securities, Oli Consulting Group, and Resource Comms. Our foundation partners, Weir Minerals. Weir Minerals delivers end-to-end solutions for all mining, transportation, milling, processing and waste management activities. Site Skills Training. Site Skills Training offers international recruitment and workplace solutions to companies in the mining, processing, oil and gas and construction industries. Our principal partners, Oztai Geophysical Consultants, advice and guidance for geophysical exploration programs being carried out in the mining and metal sector as well as the coal sector. Oztai Geophysical Consultants also provide a wide range of services to the environmental, groundwater and engineering industries. QED, Quest Exploration and Drilling, Asia's leading exploration drilling company. Modern equipment with well-trained staff has elevated QED to become the benchmark for international standard drilling operations in terrain that is generally typified by logistical constraints, geological complexity and topographical extremes. And of course, GHD. GHD has had a permanent presence in the Philippines since 1998 with over 600 professional staff spread across 3 cities in the Philippines. Their main office is in Makati and 2 branches now in Cebu City and Quezon City. They focus on creating lasting community benefit. GHD leverages on its connected global network of 10,000 employees to provide engineering and environmental management services to key players in the energy and the resources sector. Prime BMD offer to their clients services for major infrastructure projects throughout the Philippines and Southeast Asia. Expertise, experience and resources are applied across the industry sectors of transport, water, ports, resources and the energy sectors. S&P Global, Global Marketing Intelligence. S&P Global Marketing Intelligence integrates financial and industrial data, research and news into tools that help track performance, generate alpha, identify investment ideas, understand competitive and industry dynamics, perform valuations and asset risks, simplify the complexity of the evolving global mining sector from worldwide exploration discoveries, development, production, mine cost analysis, acquisition activities, industry and battery metals, markets forecasts and analysis, supply chain credit research and ESG, the most trusted global mining sector data, all in one place. That's the power of S&P Capital IQ Pro. Our industry partners, Oceanic Gold, we thank them for their ongoing support. We are also affiliated with Melbourne Mining Club, ANSCHAM, the Australian New Zealand Chamber of Commerce, PMEA, the Philippine Mining Exploration Association, COM, the Chamber of Mines of the Philippines, PMCEE, the Philippine Mine Safety Environment Association, and Yamaha Philippines. And of course, our media partner is Philippine Resources and Construction Journal. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to hand you over to Mr. Ian Lewis, who will say a few words about our EMCEE today and take you through the journey of today's program. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you, Kevin. And good afternoon to everybody. And Christine, it's a good morning. I'd like to say a few words about our MC today, Joey. Joey is a graduate of Bachelor of Science from the University of the Philippines in Diliman. He trained under MGB-UNDP for 4 years. He worked in Indonesia for 10 years. He previously worked with Cyanide Code in Limited and eventually Royalco Philippines until 2015. He currently does consulting work for a number of companies, exploration management, tenement management, government liaison, etc., and is a competent person for geology. Joey currently is the president of the Philippine Mining and Exploration Association, better known as PMEA, and has been for, wow, quite a few years, which prior to COVID restrictions, held monthly membership meetings at the Corinthian Plaza in Makati. These will obviously, like our own luncheons, recommence once COVID is past. So let's hope that everything goes well and we will all be safe. Joey was newly elected as a trustee of the Geology Society of the Philippines. He's also the current chair of the UP Geology Alumni Association. Ladies and gentlemen, I now hand you over to our MC, Mr. Joey Nelson Ayson. Joey, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar for 2022 of the Philippine Mining Club. And hopefully we will have our face-to-face meetings in a few months from now. But before I proceed with our speakers, a few webinar guidelines, and I wish to highlight the following. We will be issuing certificates of attendance to all attendees, and you can request a copy from Ms. Joan Falcotella, joan@philippineminingclub.com. For your questions addressed to our speakers, please type them in the Q&A or chat box beneath the screen. Please indicate to whom you are directing the question. I will then read them out to our speakers after all presentations during the Q&A. And we will hold the Q&A after all speakers have made their presentations. So now we've dispensed with the guidelines. Let's now go to our first speaker, a regular Stockwatch speaker, Mr. Sandy Gilles. Sandy is a financial analyst working to educate clients of the stockbroker firm First Metro Securities. He used to teach finance in college for undergraduates and for Masters of Business Administration students. Ladies and gentlemen, I now present to you our Stockwatch speaker, Sandy Gilles. Sandy?
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Sandy.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so mining and minerals, infrastructure and energy, property and development, and I'd like to talk about stocks, even though I acknowledge that it's a private company. So it's a private company, and they have owners who are shareholders, and yes, they have shares of stock, but it's in private hands. So it's not like the listed companies, which are publicly listed and their shares are traded on the market. So what happens is with the listed companies, usually there's an owner who is 30%, owns 30% of the shares. And then the public owns 70% or so, and then they buy and sell among themselves. And anyone can participate in the buying and selling of shares, especially if you have some savings and you want to put it to work in a company that you think is progressive. So therefore, you think the value of the shares will be going up year after year. Why do people buy shares? Why does the company sell shares? To raise capital. And why do people buy those shares? Because they think that their investment will go up over time. Now, if we were talking about a publicly listed company, then they would have shares of stock, which are traded or quoted on a securities exchange. And if you were interested to buy, then you would simply look at the price and then check, for example, if it's $9 or £9, and then you check if there's a seller. A seller is someone who owns the stock, but he wants to sell. And he offers me his shares at the price that he likes, which could be $10 or £10. And then if I am a buyer, then I can bid for the stock and say that I'm interested to buy, but I would like to buy at a low price. normally buyers want a bargain or a discount. And so I can bid by saying that I like to buy at $8 or £8. So then let's say that the last traded price is 9, and then the buyer wants to buy, but at the right price, which is preferably lower than the current market level. And then there is the seller who wants to sell his shares at an offer price or asking price. So he's asking for 10 or 11, and that's the normal interaction between buyers and sellers. Sellers want to sell high, and buyers want to buy low, and they then negotiate among themselves. This happens at every stock exchange in the world. For that matter, it happens in every marketplace in the world. Okay. And then if you look in the share stock exchange, then you might see numbers like Philex Mining. On the left side are those who want to buy, they are bidding. And then on the right side are those who are interested to sell because they own shares and they're asking for a price that's normally higher than the last traded price. So in the case of Philex Mining, 5.32 was the last traded price. And the people who are interested to sell want something higher than that. Meanwhile, the people who want to buy normally want to buy lower than 5.32. So then they negotiate among themselves openly. Everyone can see what's happening, and you can just jump in and participate at the level where you think that it's a fair price and interested to buy the share of stock, whether Philex Mining or some other Philippine mining company. So those who want to buy are placing bids, and those who want to sell are asking for a certain price, or they're offering their shares at this price. What do we do now with the shares of a private company? Well, since Wardell Armstrong is a private company, well, you may still offer to buy their shares, but in this case, you need to approach the company and ask them if they are willing to sell you their shares. You'll need to enter into a direct conversation. Now, why would they be interested to sell? The reasons for selling shares for a good company are to be able to enter into a partnership with the potential buyer, to enter into an alliance with someone who is strategically very interesting. It's possible that you sell some shares so that you have access to customers, to a longer and better customer list. Or maybe the person who wants to buy shares in your company has access to resources, more lands or more mines, for example, and that's what he brings to the table. For the buyer, the reasons for buying are you try to buy the shares when they are at a low price, and then when the company does well, the value of your shares goes up, and then years later, you can sell off the shares for a higher value. So we're now doing the stock watch, and in a while we'll talk about the cyanide in mining. What happens if the private company wants to raise capital from the public? Well, they sell shares to the public and by consulting the London Stock Exchange in their example. This is what the external of the London Stock Exchange looks like. It's usually for the big companies and the very established companies. If someone is a young company wanting to get into the stock exchange, then they normally approach through the alternative investment market for the AIM. It's for small and medium-sized companies. There are many other types of securities markets in the UK, including derivatives exchanges. So it's just for information that they have many marketplaces where you can trade all kinds of instruments and securities. In the Philippines, there's also a market for small and medium enterprises. It's called the SME Board, Small and Medium Enterprises. And one recent listing was Housestock. They did an initial public offering or IPO. All the companies altogether, 278, are listed in the Philippines. And the ones that we are really interested in are the biggest mining and oil companies. And they're in this list called the Index for Mining and Oil. There's more of them, actually. Here's a longer list of the mining and oil companies, but usually they're summarized on a daily basis by talking about the biggest 11 companies. You can search for them on any broker website. As for the overall stock market, it's represented by this chart, which is the Philippine Stock Index, which is a number representing the top 30 stocks in the Philippines since 1980s. And fortunately, share prices have risen 8% a year since 1988. They seem to have been declining in the last 2 years, especially because of the COVID year 2020. But then I hope it will recover, and I anticipate it will follow the blue line. Of course, it's always possible that they stagnate and follow the green line, and it's also possible that they decline following the red line. But given the pace of progress and the economy reawakening, I'm hopeful that it will follow this blue arrow, which is generally following the pace of the economy, which we hope to be seeing it grow 6% a year in the coming years. So I'm thinking that the yellow line will be the dominant forecast. Okay, so to know more about investment funds, just ask me later. This is my email address. I'm just here to do the stock watch. The topic for today is cyanide in the mining industry. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Bye.
Okay, thank you, Sandy, for educating us. I know you put in Felix because SEC just cleared their 3 billion stock rights offering, so we hope to see the stocks go up in the short term or in the longer term. So hopefully, and Christine is here for Wardell Armstrong. People you might want to talk to Christine as a director on getting into Wardell Armstrong. So anyway, thank you for your Stockwatch presentation, and if there will be questions, we can get back to you later. And now let's go to our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Christine Blackmore is an associate director at Wardell Armstrong International, working as a geoenvironmentalist and environmental auditor with some 20 years experience in the international mining and metallurgical industry. Her expertise is focused on environmental due diligence, management, and auditing to international best practices. Her work has included preparation, implementation, and auditing of environmental management systems, the ISO 14001, and many of her projects have included management of hazardous goods transportation, whether by road or rail or shipping, on-site storage, the containment areas, procedures, security, inspections, and the handling, which are the usage and procedures, health and safety and hazard assessments, emergency response preparedness, social and community work. Christine has also worked on sensitive political, social, and economic studies where interaction with interested stakeholders has been complex. Like when you are involving the governor or ministers, and Christine has experience in that. And she has also presented at large-scale community gatherings or mine open days or with NGOs and liaised with both national and local government agencies. She has also worked internationally in areas such as Sub-Saharan Africa, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Morocco, and even Congo, DRC. So Mexico, Armenia, and all other countries, including UK for several years, and in many challenging environments. And it has involved her in the extraction and processing of many commodities from precious metals and base metals and to coal. Christine is a principal auditor accredited with the International Register Certificated Auditors, or IRCA, for ISO 14001 2015. And one of her most recent projects was to review and monitor the development of an EMS, including its implementation and operational auditing. Christine is also an accredited lead cyanide auditor with the International Cyanide Management Institute, ICMI, for the Cyanide Code for the gold mining industry, and having undertaken audits for both operational mines, including process plants and transportation of cyanide. She has prepared several cyanide management plans for new and operational gold mines, and some of the work in developing cyanide awareness training and the preparation for the standard operating procedures. Her clients involve private companies, investment bankers, government departments, and design institutes. Christine is also experienced in preparing mine and process closure plans, including financial assessments, social closure planning, and remediation, rehabilitation, and has vast experience in tailings dam construction works. Christine is a registered European Union expert assessor for mining, mineral processing, and extraction waste for environmental studies. She has been appointed Vice President of the Institute of Materials, Minerals, and Mining, which we call IOM3, and is a chairman of the Mining Technology Board. Prior to this, she was the First Lady President of the Western Institute of Mining and Minerals for 11 years. Ladies and gentlemen, a virtual welcome for Christine Blackmore. Christine?
Oh, thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. I have to pinch myself to think if it's still me, this. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today at the Philippines Mining Club. I'm going to focus on talking about cyanide, which is my keynote speech today, among other things that I've done in the past for Wardell Armstrong. If you go to on next slide, these are just a few of the credentials that I've got. The most important ones are ones that have just been discussed, is lead cyanide auditor and principal auditor. You need to be, for a cyanide auditor, you need to have been a principal auditor with ERCA before you lead on to being a lead cyanide auditor, plus the experience that you need to go with it. Next slide, please. I always like to look at this particular slide because I think it's quite an important thing that Pericles said about poison. And poison is in everything, and nothing exists without poison. So if you think about pears that's got formaldehyde, potatoes that's got selenium, and even in your smartphones, you've got lead, arsenic, antimony, cobalt. So it's quite important to think that poison is in everything and nothing exists without poison. So it's quite, I found it quite an important thing that he did say. Next slide, please. Before I started, when I started doing cyanide, I didn't realize cyanide was so naturally occurring, and it's in plants, it's in algae, it's in seeds and fruit stones, car fumes, cigarettes. So it's quite a naturally occurring chemical that I think a lot of people didn't realize, and I certainly didn't realize before I started cyanide auditing. Next slide, please. So what's the uses of cyanide other than mining? Because we, who I presume are listening all today, have some affiliation to mining, so we would know that cyanide's used in the gold mining and silver industries. So what else is it used for? The things that I was surprised at was food processing, and also medicines for anti-cancer medicines. I didn't realize that cyanide had such a applicability to other industries. Next slide, please. Out of all the world's production of cyanide, there's only 18% actually used in the mining industry. The rest is all used in the industries that we've discussed on the previous slide. So in respect, it's quite minimal, and the 82% is somewhere else. But cyanide is a very emotive name, shall we say. Next slide, please. at the mining sites, in general, solid briquettes are used. They look like, I don't know if you can make them out, they look like little white cobbles. These are generally used, but there is powder forms that you can use. But mostly it's this that's used in the mine industry and for precious metals. This is predominantly for precious metals, for gold and silver, but also base metals to prevent pyrite from floating. Next slide, please. I always find this quite an interesting slide because the word cyanide conjures up all sorts of things, memories from World War II and it being sparkling cyanide when you've done them whodunits and everything. But actually, it's more environmentally friendly than the alternatives. If you look at the concentrations of the alternatives to cyanide, which is thyro, which is 10,000 ppm, thiosulfate, 11,000 ppm, and 63,000 for iodide, chloride, and bromide. But equally, if you look at the pH level, cyanide is an alkali and needs to be kept as an alkali. Well, it's usually 10.5 above, but I'll just put 11 into that. And how actually, besides the other one, which is thiosulfate, everything is very, very acidic. If you go on to the next page, as we just discussed, alternatives to cyanide can be just as hazardous as cyanide, and they even come in higher concentrations. One thing about the alternatives, not one of them is actually biodegradable, where cyanide is biodegradable in sunlight. It disappears in the water and that. And cyanide isn't carcinogenic, which some of the alternatives are. So it's kind of important to note that cyanide isn't all bad in that respect when you look at the alternatives that there is for the gold and silver mining industry. Next slide, please. As I say, I'm a lead auditor with the International Cyanide Management Institute and do audits around the world. It's a very good audit for dangerous goods as well. And it's a very useful audit. Bear in mind, it's a voluntary thing, but what the benefits are from being part of the International Cyanide Management Institute for a mining company is when you're looking for investment from bankers or financial institutions, it's a good way of the mine being able to demonstrate to people outside of the mining industry that the cyanide they're going to use is handled, stored, and used to best practices. And even when you're trying to talk to governments, not everybody works in the mining industry and would understand how it's handled and stored. So it's a good demonstration to be part of this voluntary initiative, that for you to be able to say, well, this is how it's handled and stored. It's been independently audited, and it's a recognition for that particular mining company to say all their procedures is correct, the transportations in order to the safe management of cyanide. Next slide, please. The Cyanide Code really started around about the year 2000. So obviously been going about 22 years. Well, it will be 22 years this year. And it started with the breach of a tailings dam in Romania called the Blackmore. Some people might have heard of it and other people haven't. What happened was, and if you can see in the one picture, it's where the dam breached, the cyanide tailings went into the river courses, and eventually it went down into the River Danube, which is a very famous river, and it killed an awful lot of fish in there. After that disaster, Unfortunately, nobody was killed. It was flora and fauna, which is still important. The United Nations decided to put a steering group together to develop a cyanide best practices code, and this is where the code started to develop. And in 2001, it was launched. Next slide, please. There is to make the closed circuit of cyanide, auditors audit on the production of cyanide, the supply chain of cyanide, and the operational side, which is the mining side. I have lead accreditation for the supply chain and the operational usage. Production of cyanide is usually done by a different auditor to myself. The main things, I'm just talking about the transportation and supply chain. There is 3 elements to that particular audit. It talks about the transport. The transport audit would cover such as rail, road, sea, and inland waterways. And it's very important that these are independently done. They have their own audit, which has to be passed. On the interim storage is basically before it gets to site. And this could be for such as a broker that buys in cyanide, stores it before he sells it onto the mine. They could be part and parcel of a transportation audit. I'd be looking at the warehouse and how it was stored, how it was managed. And of course, emergency response is very important. Say we have a spillage, it needs to be responded to, and it needs to be safely responded to. Next slide, please. For the actual mine site, it's more the process plant really, as opposed to the actual mine itself, because the cyanide trail starts really at the compound and when it comes through the gates. And as it does look at the production, in as much as are you contracting towards a manufacturer that's actually got accredited status. So it could be a closed loop of it all being, the whole chain could be audited. Transportation, you do it on a supply chain, and it's just requesting whether the other pieces of the supply chain have been audited. On the mine site, we pick up at the handling and storage, which would be the cyanide compound. Operations, decommissioning, worker safety, emergency response, training and dialogue. They're the 9 principles. And out of these, there's 33 standards that you have to achieve. Next slide, please. This is just a typical cyanide process. Generally, they work on closed loop circuits. The normal ones that we look at is the carbon in leach. We look at carbon in pulp, carbon in resin, merrill crow plants. And I pick up with the cyanide auditing just the pieces that's applicable to the handling and use of cyanide. Outside of that, that doesn't belong to the cyanide auditing as such. Next slide, please. Just looking at transportation, I will say all the photographs that I've used for this presentation are from cyanide audits that I've been doing around the world, whether it's Latin America, which is the big vehicle, Africa is one of the bottom ones, and Russia and Kazakhstan are the pictures on here. And I would be looking basically at the route it's going to be taken. I'd be looking at the vehicles, the inspection of the vehicles, maintenance of the vehicles. I'd also be looking at the driver qualifications. Now, there is some international standards for the transportation of dangerous goods. So it's important that ADR, which is the road transport, RID, which is the rail transport, International Maritime Organization, and inland waterways. There is these international standards, and a lot of the standards are applicable to the Cyanide Code. So it's important that these standards are adhered to. In such as the International Maritime Organization, that's for shipping and ports, because one of the things that you do, when the cyanide comes into the port, you'd be looking at the ship's manifest to see where it was stored on board ship. You'd be looking at the unloading of it and whether it goes into a dangerous goods compound on the port. So these sometimes have to be done as an environmental due diligence, because not all ports, such as I've just been doing one lately for St. Petersburg port in Russia, and it's not open to visitors. So what I have to do is a lot of research and an environmental due diligence of that to fit what the questions are for the cyanide audit. Next slide, please. So handling and storage, when it arrives at the mine site, it has to be in secure compounds. It generally comes in the shipping containers, as you could see. It also needs to have a proper security. It has to be moved correctly, and the storage compound needs to be well ventilated, which most of you probably know. And it's very important, these procedures, for both environmental and human health protection. And you need to monitor where the cyanide is, like your stock control, stock in, stock out. Now, if you look at the one on the bottom right-hand corner, this is taken from a warehouse in Mexico. And this is from a broker. And what the broker does, he buys in the cyanide, he stores the cyanide outside the shipping containers and puts them in a storage unit in the boxes. And then he will put them in a vehicle and ship them out. And that was the vehicle that you could see earlier on. But if it's going by rail, obviously it goes in the shipping containers. If it's going directly from the manufacturer straight to the mine site, it will go in a shipping container. And it's equally important that the integrity of the shipping container is also audited. Next slide, please. Just some photographs really from the cyanide auditing. And if you look at sort of when they're doing mixing, I would be looking at the PPE that they wear, how they cordon off the area, because it's very important when you're doing cyanide mixing that the area is cordoned off to prevent anybody wandering into that area because of cyanide. Everybody needs to be equipped with the appropriate PPE, such as the piping that goes that carries anything to do with cyanide. I'd be looking at it all being shown, as you can see on the bottom, that we know it contains cyanide. We also need to know the flow direction of that particular solution. I also look at the integrity of each piece of equipment, which is also important. And I also be looking at the procedures of how you wear your PPE, what task training you do, and is there a procedure for every single item of work that you need to do towards cyanide. Next page, please. One, as I say, you need to be looking at the integrity, such as the integrity of the bunds. I would be, the bund is where it's kind of a catchment that you would put your tanks in. So I would be looking at the capacity of the tanks. I would be looking at the capacity of the bund to make sure that if there is a rupture of a tank, the cyanide solution could be contained in that. Need to look whether there's a sump in there. Need to make sure it connects with the and the cyanide can be put back into the circuit. I would be looking at this. I will also look at the floor, because of any cracks in the floor, in the concrete, so that if there is a spillage, it won't be released into the environment through a crack in the floor. Importantly, as I say, I look at all the integrity of the pipes, I look at the tanks, how often are the tanks maintained, what's the daily checks that people do for these around the mine site, because I'll be looking at the checklist. Is it a good checklist? Are they noting when maintenance needs to done and the maintenance procedure to sign off? That's part of it. And this is another different sort of, this is an outside cyanide one because it's quite hot in Africa. Sometimes, I mean, such as in Russia where it's very cold, your mixing plant is inside. In Africa, it's outside because of the heat. Next slide, please. Quite familiar probably with some of you. This is a heap leach. Heap leaches are tended to use for low grade gold. In general, they're HDP line. This is the top of a mountain in Mexico, and literally the gold is dug out of the top of the mountain, and then that was lined with HDPE. So I would be looking at the integrity of the lining system. I'd be looking at how it was installed. I'd be looking at how the ore rock is crushed and put onto the HDPE, because what you don't want is it to be holes in it. Are the operators depositing properly? The other thing is, if you could see at the bottom, the pipelines, and now this is a sprinkler system. Equally, we need to make sure that that sprinkler system is only sprinkling the ore rock that's on the heap leach and not going outside. So I'd be looking at the bunded areas to make sure that cyanide doesn't go outside into the environment. I'd also be looking at the collection ponds. I couldn't put all the pictures in today, but when the cyanide literally works its way through the layers of ore rock, and then it's collected in pipes, then it's collected in a reservoir, and your gold and silver is in solution, is in the cyanide solution. When it's got into the cyanide solution, one of the ways of getting back is in your carbon in leach, and this is coconut shells at the bottom. There is different carbons people use, but I'd say there's a good 50 or 60% of people, of companies that are using coconut shells as a preference, and this is where it starts to get the gold out of the solution. Next slide, please. Just a little bit on tailings management facilities. I would be ensuring that because the water and the tailings from processors, in some mining sites, you either get a heap leach or there's a tailings dam. Occasionally you get both. It depends on the ore rocks that's the feedstocks coming in, but in general you have either one or the other. Anyway, they're both important, and unless you can prove very, very well that cyanide water wouldn't leak, HDPE used. Occasionally they use natural materials, but you've got to have good clay for good compacting. My background to start off with was construction engineer on building tailings dams, and I go as more of an inspector these days, but that was my start off. So I find them quite interesting when I go around tailings dams and heap leaches, because that was my bread and butter kind of job when I very first started in the mining industry. So, but it's important that the people on site, because I've seen one or two occurrences where, yes, they've done a nice job on installing the tailings dam or the heap leach HDPE, and they've bought their own welding equipment to do any patches if there's any holes and that. But the unfortunate part is, while they've bought all this equipment, I have noticed that sometimes the people that actually do the patching and welding, which is important because we obviously don't want the cyanide water to go into the environment, they don't really understand the preparation work you need to do before you actually weld it. So it's quite important that the procedures are checked and the experience, and that can they actually do this job. I didn't say they couldn't do the patching. They couldn't. They could, but they didn't prepare it properly. So the HDPE patches, you could just rip them off with your fingers. Well, that's no good when you're dealing with cyanide, obviously. So I would be looking at the design, and I'd also be looking at what we call the CQA inspection, which is the construction quality assurance. And those are the things that I used to produce after I'd done a tailings dam build or a landfill build many years ago, to see whether it's actually been approved and what does it fit the criteria of what you want. I would also be seeing whether they've actually got a manual how to operate the tailings dam, because for every tailings dam that's built around the world, generally a manual is written to actually how you operate this dam, because while many of us think it's just a big pond of water and you put the tailings in, there is actually a rhyme and reason, shall we say, as to how you build your tailings dams up, with tailings and beaching and keeping the freeboard down and getting the water back if you can use it on a closed loop system. So it's quite important. It's quite an important, it's a poor relation in some respects because it doesn't really make you a lot of money, but it's a very important part of your mining industry. Next slide, please. Then we look at decommissioning and remediation. This one, it's not a particularly big picture of it, but this is a cyanide former tailings dam, and it was capped off with HDPE, and then it had a fluffing layer of clay, and then it had topsoil put on there as well. So it's nice and abundant, and can be used for grazing or crops or whatever you want to use it for. So the capping part is a very important part, and equally talking about making a closure plan, because in general today, when you have to do an ESIA to actually fund a mine, part of the ESIA is to do a conceptual closure plan. As a rule of thumb, 2 years before a closure of a mine, you would actually do your detailed. So that would be more in blow, but you need to have one in place. The other thing that the auditing would be looking at is the financial bond, and as to because it's not going to be cheap to actually close a mine, which we know. But I only really look at the cyanide part of it. But I need to know for the audit, what's the financial guarantee? I don't need to know the actual figure. I need to know that there's one in place. Is it linked to inflation? How is money being added to it? To make sure that when the closure is going to be coming up, there's sufficient money in there to actually close all the cyanide facilities. I don't need to look at the rest of the mine for this particular looking at the code. It just purely concentrates on where cyanide is going to be used. Aftercare planning is also something that we would expect to see in a closure plan, which you know. Aftercare planning, can't make a total decision on what your aftercare is going to be, but there needs to be some sort of management structure in there for later. most mines that I've worked on, they work on a 5-year aftercare plan. And if you get to 5 years and you've had no leakages, excuse me, no leakages, it can go back to the land could go back to the government, or it could go back to the former landowners, that you've taken every environmental precaution. However, if there's any leakages, or one of the key things is if there's any diebacks of flora in the area or on your capping, you know, you have to be looking at that kind of thing to notice why that's going on. So your aftercare plan could well be extended up until the time as people are happy to sign it off or take it back into their use. Next slide, please. Worker safety. This is an important one we audit on. One of the things is, you know, you're looking at your safety safety warning signs. You're looking at PPE. You're looking at the resources of PPE. So everybody that works in the process plant has got access to good quality personal protection. I'd be looking at task procedures to keep all workers safe. And I'd be looking at the inspections that they do every morning, especially around the process plant. Who does that? Who signs it off? Does the process plant manager go around every week or every month? And I'd also be looking at the process of, if something is going wrong, how is it reported? Who takes control of it then? Does it go to sign off? So these are all sorts of things that I would be looking at for worker safety. Next slide, please. Emergency response. One of the big sections to make sure that if something does go wrong, there is a 24-hour team. Now, the Cyanide Code requires you to do drills or exercises, whatever you'd like to call them. So when I go to a site, and I always say to them, it might be in your interest to do a cyanide drill while I'm here, so we can make sure we've done one. And I would do it as the same as what you do an ordinary drill, with time out, how long it took for the emergency response to get to the process plant or the compound, what emergency equipment you've got. I'd be looking at the cyanide antidotes to see what are you using. Are you using crystals as a first response, antidotes arriving with the medical staff? I'd be looking at the roles and responsibilities of not only the people on site, but also if you have to call in the emergency service, the national emergency services, how are you interacting with the emergency services? In such as Russia, the emergency services are always called for any incident, and they would take over and take control of the situation. So it's important, and this goes on in many countries, but it's important that actually the emergency response team on site, it can also interact with the external, the national civil defence as well. So I'd be checking all that kind of thing. I mean, there is quite a lot to the audit. I can't go through everything today, but, and I'd also be looking at like the emergency response team training. What training have they had? Do they do refresher training? And the people that's in the ER team, because it's important that a lot of mines work on a 24/7 shift. So I'd be looking to see whether you've got sufficient trained emergency responders on each shift within the processing plant or the compound, so that you could deal with incidents. Next slide, please. Training. I like to sit in on the trainings. This one's from Mexico. I'm sitting there at the back. Cyanide awareness training to all employees. It's important when you're on a mine site that everybody knows that you use cyanide. Special tasks, yes, for the process plant or the compound they need to do. Individual training records, rolling program of cyanide awareness, refresher training needs to be done. And who's actually doing the training? What qualifications have the staff got to actually train the workers? So that's another important one. And what I tend to do when I go on an audit, I like to choose people at random and follow their training records all the way through. When's the refresher training? What have they been trained in? So I don't sort of have training records presented to me. I like to just pick the worker and then start following there. So it's a very random one, and I believe it's quite a robust way of approaching the audit to make sure. Next slide, please. And finally, dialogue. Dialogue's quite important because this is your local communities. And the Cyanide Code does stipulate, does the community know you use cyanide? Are you compliant with legislation and regulations within that country or in that region, shall we say? It's important to have stakeholder engagement. And it's important that there's emergency response in the community. For an example, if by any awful means that there's been an incident, cyanide water gets into the local water supply, who's responsible for the potable water that you're going to give to the community? Making sure that's in place. Hopefully it'll never happen, but if it does, we need to know the roles and responsibilities of the ER to look after the community. It's also important that there is some sort of community liaison. Generally, there's some sort of manager within the community that can give updates on cyanide. Hopefully not on cyanide incidents, but making people aware and people understanding, because it's better to tell people up front that, yes, we are using cyanide, we're using it safely. And that's kind of where the Cyanide Code comes in. It's a demonstration that that mine is working to the best plan, whether it to present to the community or to stakeholders or to the government or to financiers, because not everybody knows about cyanide. Not everybody knows about handling and storage, and it's like a comfort blanket to if you're going for some investment, because a lot of the factors today people want to know, it's more environmental and community orientated these days. So it's very important that independent audits are done, in my opinion, to actually demonstrate these things, and we can just hand the report over. These are also published as a summary. The audit actually covers a detailed audit as well as a summary audit. Now, the summary audits are the summary of the audit is what's actually published. The detailed audit of what goes on and how it was compiled is all things that are kept on file. And these are kept on file for 3 years. Then you have to have a recertification to look at any changes on your particular mine site. So it's important. It's an important document, I believe, and I quite believe in the Cyanide Code. Having worked in auditing for many years, it's a good audit. These are just sort of pictures from when I've gone and done talks into the community. I'm in Northern Ireland on the one that's on the left. In the middle, that's Mexico, and on the right, that's when I was doing a government day in Africa. Next slide, please. And finally, have you any questions for me? I hope, thank you for listening for one thing, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I'd be very pleased to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. Very excellent and informative presentation. I know you had to get up much earlier than what you would normally do on a Friday. So thank you for gracing this event.
Right.
And, may I just remind everyone that if you have questions, put them in the Q&A or the chat box, which you can see on your screen. And we'll start with the first one. This one is from Ernie Villaluna. Most of the guys know Ernie Villaluna here. He's one of the pillars of the industry. But very few people know that one of his earlier jobs was he was supplying cyanide to the industry. He's a mining engineer, but I know he also started with being a metallurgist, and somewhere along the line, I think chemistry was not his forte. But then, again, he went into cyanide supply. And this is his question, since he supplied cyanide before. He would like to know the effectiveness of the new lixiviants being used in the recovery of precious metals. I think you had a slide 8 which showed the various alternatives to cyanide.
Yeah.
And how effective are those compared to cyanide? That was what Ernie would like to know.
Well, I don't know all the facts and figures as to what they are, but I am told, and on other research that I've done, cyanide is the best, and which does can recover, as far as I understand, about 95%, if not more. But the other ones aren't as effective actually as cyanide. As I say, I don't know because I've never audited on them. I've never audited on the use of those. I've only ever done cyanide, and cyanide is the most accepted in the world, and it's been used in the industry, I believe, since the 1800s. And as far as I understand, it's the most effective there is. There is nothing to compare with cyanide at this point in time. But I think more importantly is the factors, the alternative, shall we say, aren't biodegradable. You see, what cyanide is, if cyanide goes into the water in sunlight, it biodegrades. In general, when the cyanide solution is finished with, and you have to send the tailings to the tailings dam, it always goes through a treatment process, like an INCO process, which destroys also the cyanide. So by the time it gets into the dam, you're looking at probably less than 10 ppm. The Cyanide Code depicts on 5 ppm, and an INCO system can reach below that, so 2 ppm. Most water can be recycled, so you've got some sort of decant chamber or pump where it goes back into the process plant. So it sort of works on this closed loop system. That probably doesn't answer the question fully, but I haven't audited on those other things. I just know that you can use them, but there is a downside of using those particular ones.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Here's a follow-up question from Roger Dimel. We had a presentation a few months ago by a group, Clean Earth Technologies. I think it's based out of Singapore, and I don't think they were advocating another method or process or other than cyanide. Would you be able to comment on this? If I remember right, they used thiosulfate or something. I'm not really sure, but would you be able to?
Thiosulfate is used, as I say, they are used in the industry. I haven't audited on them, so I don't know as much about them as I do cyanide. And as far as I know, besides doing environmental due diligence on them, there isn't a particular code that's used for those. As far as, well, certainly not in my experience. I've been to a mine site, it's always been a cyanide one, and cyanide is the most recognized one, and it's the most accepted one. Sorry, just repeat your question. I've gone off.
Okay. Anyway, here's one from Eric Nera. He's one of the foremost metallurgists here. He says, one irony is that detoxification procedures for cyanide involve use of chemicals which are actually more toxic than cyanide itself. Are there any new processes that use chemicals which are less toxic?
There is a new process that I have heard of, and it's kind of experimental at the time. At the moment, it does use but it doesn't use a chemical. I think it uses more of an acid, but it's only been effective on a certain kind of ore rock. See, not all ore rocks lend themselves to this new process. So you've got it all stems down to what ore rock you're going to be using and using it to the best ability for your financial reasons, because that's what the game is to make money out of your gold mine. So, and the new process that's coming, it would mean a lot of adaptation to existing mines. But as I say, it doesn't work with all different geological strata. Shall we put it that way?
So it's a bit specific for different type of ore.
Yeah, like that. It doesn't work with all ores.
So Eric, I hope that answers your question. Here's another one. What about monitoring? Because that would be a very important part of cyanide.
Yeah, and that part comes under operationals, because there's a lot to do with monitoring what's in the tailings dam, monitoring the boreholes, because generally when you've got a process plant or mine site, you've got upstream, downstream monitoring boreholes. And with your tailings dam, you've certainly got monitoring boreholes and leak detections in there. So you would be monitoring that. And that does form part of the audit. As I say, I couldn't mention everything because there's too much to mention. I'd be here all day. You don't want me here all day. But monitoring does form part of it. And also there's quite a bit on wildlife and fencing your tailings dam off or your heap leach off, and bird scaring, things like that are included in the audit. I just haven't talked on every single thing today.
Yeah, well, here's a clarification. Green Earth Technology is promoting glycerin as an alternative to cyanide, but they still mix it with cyanide. It's from Henry Salvado.
Glycerine?
Yeah. So that's what he says on the.
I've not come across. Yeah. I have not come across glycerine. I've come across. I mean, you have to put your lime in your water round about 12 to 24 hours in advance of adding your cyanide, because you need to get your pH level up because they're generating cyanide gas. So you need to get your pH level correct in the first place. Then you add your cyanide. I haven't heard of glycerine, but I've generally heard of lime.
Okay. Anyway, Eric Wardell wants to clarify that he actually meant chemicals used for the detox process, when he mentioned the use of chemicals actually more toxic than cyanide itself. So it's the use of chemicals for the detox process.
In the INCO system, they do use one of the chemicals that's not permitted to use I can't think of the name now, but it's sulfate. So that's not permissible to use, but it goes through the INCO system. The INCO system isn't something that I specifically audit on. I sort of finish as the tailings start to go through it, making sure it goes through the process, and I do the monitoring before it gets there, and then I also monitor when it comes out the other side, so we know that the INCO system is working correctly. I don't actually audit what goes on in the INCO system. I just audit before. Water in, water out. That's my bit.
Okay, fair enough. Here's one from Thierry Maisunabe. What do you think of the methods such as alkaline chlorinization used in the old times. Alkaline chlorinization used in the old times. What do you think of that?
The alkaline chlorination. I don't know what I think of that because
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Put my hand up. I don't know that one.
Yeah, something to research on. Now let's digest somewhat. We've all been talking about cyanide, but in the Philippines, it's actually mercury. That's a big problem.
Yeah, with the artisanal
small-scale miners, artisanal miners. So, what would your views on this?
Well, it's not good to use mercury because it's detrimental not only to the people that's using it, it's detrimental to the environment. The mercury, they mix the mercury with the water and then and the soils, and then the gold makes an amalgam with the mercury, and then it's smelted. They vaporize the mercury, whether with heat, whether it's in a little oven kind of thing, or whether it's with a blowtorch or that sort of thing. And it's the vapor also with the people, because they're not wearing any PPE, you've got to remember. And it's the mercury vapor that actually they're inhaling, or it's getting on the skin, or it's going outside into the atmosphere. The other thing is when they get rid of the water, of course, the mercury, although it's some of it's volatilized, it actually goes into the water streams, and of course that goes into drinking water, that goes into the plants. So then you start getting this mercury poisoning on a loop, but and it's very detrimental to use actually mercury because of the air quality. There's no air quality control on it. There's water remediation that needs to be done. So when they finished with their tailings, they put it into the river or a local, or even leave it on the soil itself with that mercury content. So it's bad for the environment, and it's certainly bad for the people.
Okay, it's really how we sort of contain cyanide or see that it's really used properly. But how do you well, it's still about the monitoring. How do you see that you can identify if there are leaks in the system or a spillage for your cyanide processed water? Would you be able to do that to identify any leaks in the process, so that you know?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's kind of coming into use is a lot is a food dye called carmazine, and it's a red food dye. It's not detrimental by any means to the cyanide process, and you put that in when you're doing your mixing, and it's red. So when your cyanide goes through your pipes or your tanks, when you see a red spillage come out, you know it's cyanide water, whereas at the moment it's a clear liquid. So sometimes if your process is partly outside and partly inside, it could be rainwater, but you don't know. But it's easier to recognise if you've got this food dye. It hasn't got to be a particularly red one. It just happens to be one that's more widely used. I mean, there is other colour food dyes. And then gradually, as the food dye goes through the chain and it comes out into the tailings dams, you don't get red water. It will go back to being more water looking as opposed to a red liquid. But it's the new. It's a new thing. It's a new thing. It's not over new because we've known about food dyes for a long time. It's just a case of it's not been used in the process quite widely. But it is something that people are considering. It's now a requirement of the code that it's put in there for identification purpose. And it's a good thing, really, because it doesn't upset your process at all, by any means. But it's good. And then you can actually spot straight away if you've got a leaking pipe or the buns is leaking. So it's a good thing to use the dye.
Okay. Thank you for that. During the last part of your presentation, the later part, you were mentioning about some guys fixing the TSF, on cyanide containment. Would you expound further on that, on what you would prescribe for a tailings dam construction to ensure that there's no cyanide leakage or spillage?
Well, this is what the HDPE. Well, when you build a tailings dam, I mean, sometimes you can have compacted clay. Depends on the compaction of your clay. But a lot of them insist on having HDPE, which is the high density polythene. And this all has to be welded together. So it's important when you're looking at building your tailings dam that you actually, all the welds and patches are all done professionally. Because when it came to light in one I was working on in Russia, I won't tell you which one it is, but it was come to light in Russia. And they happened to be wanting to give me a demonstration on this patching ability. And I stood and watched it and I thought, that's not patching ability, because there is a certain method to actually preparing surfaces. All right, it's only grinding, cleaning and whatever, but that's what makes the patch stick. So it's important that whoever's working on the repairs of tailings dams or heap leaches actually have been trained to do it correctly. Because what we don't want is cyanide water going through the HDPE and into watercourses. We don't want any leaks. I mean, you've generally got your borehole monitoring, but we don't want to find cyanide water in the borehole monitors. We want to keep it where it should be, in the tailings dam.
Okay, here's another one related to thiosulfate. It's a comment on an earlier question on how would you compare the toxicity of cyanide versus that of thiosulfate?
Well, you've got to think that I only know really a lot about cyanide. Cyanide's only used. It's used in a weak solution. It's not a strong solution. Let's get that bit. The thing with cyanide, it's biodegradable. So if there is any cyanide that goes into the tailings dam in the water, whether it be 5 ppm or 10 ppm. 10 ppm is what the European Union specify. 5 ppm is what the Institute applies. See, when it goes in there, that 5% will still be biodegradable, which it is, whereas the others aren't. So you've always got that toxic solution, whereas with cyanide, you haven't got the toxic solution because it biodegrades in sunlight.
So that's always a good slide. Your slide number 8, where you show the alternatives and the pH.
Yeah, and the concentration.
Concentrations on how much concentration you use for that specific lixiviant.
Yeah. Well, you've got to think that isn't biodegradable. Those tailings aren't biodegradable. The tailings water, shall we say. So, plus the factors, they're carcinogenic as well. So there's a lot of downsides to the alternatives. And that's why cyanide is still approved. I mean, even in the EU, it's approved with the usage. I think it was Minister Pasternak in about 2010 was saying it was the most environmentally friendly, so which it is. I mean, it's like everything else. If you handle it, store it and manage it correctly, it's not going to be a detrimental to society, but that's what the auditing is all about. And that's what the management on site is all about, handling it correctly, because it is a killer and it is toxic.
Hey, I'm trying to look for any other question. Joe or Ian, are you seeing any other questions, new ones?
It's very interesting when you got two geologists talking to each other.
I was thinking also of something like, you've got all your monitoring, but would you have like a backup plan, like a secondary containment, something like that? Or
well, yeah, because I mean, what we also look at is what we call buns. I don't know if you call them buns in the Philippines, but they're called buns. So that's one of the things for the tanks and the pipes within the process plant. Outside of that, if you're looking at pipelines that go to the tailings dam, or for the return water, or for the water going out there, you use secondary containments for the pipelines, and I'd also be looking at that. You know, are they in a HDPE line channel, or are they being wrapped? I mean, I've got lots of pictures of those type of things, but they do form part of it to make sure there is a secondary containment in case there's a rupture or anything like that.
I think in the Philippines we even have even for our fuel depot, we should have bunds to have any spillages, to catch any spillages.
Yeah.
But here's a question from Marcel Villegas. What mine were you talking in Mexico? As featured in your slide and photos. What mine was that in Mexico?
Dolores.
Was that?
Dolores. It's in the Sierra Madre Mountains. I say it's just outside Chihuahua. It's a flight outside of Chihuahua.
So it's a gold mine. It's a gold mine.
Yes.
Okay, that should answer your question, Marcel.
Does Marcel Asmusel work there?
No, I thought she might have been to Mexico or to
oh, right. Well, I have, because it was one of my audits. They use a Merrill Crowe process at that one.
Christine, have you ever been to Australia?
No.
Because obviously, well, what, 1/3 of the gold in the world is produced in Australia?
Well, I mean, we have to be commissioned for, I work for Wardell Armstrong. At the end of the day, if the mining company write to Wardell Armstrong and say, can we have an audit? Christina put her hand up and say, yeah, I'm coming, you know, and it all boils down to price. But what you've got to think about is Australia will have its own auditors, shall we say. I mean, I tend to go to outlandish places like Siberia and the top of a mountain in Mexico, or the middle of the Sahara Desert, that kind of place. Do you know what I mean? So, and it's I don't know whether there's any cyanide auditors accredited in Australia. I presume that somebody must do it. But if they don't, I'll put my hand. I'll send you a proposal if you want me to do one. I'll take it for business.
Sandy Gilles is in Australia, so you may Sandy, you can point Christine in the right direction.
Yeah.
Christine, the Philippines probably holds 1/3 of the world's unresourced mineralization at the moment. Have you had much experience here?
Not in the Philippines as such, no. I have worked in other Asian countries, but not the Philippines. But I'm open for offers.
Well, you mentioned earlier about your decommissioning plan. We actually have our final mine rehabilitation and decommissioning plan, and you submit that at the first day. So it's not 2 years before or 5 years before closure. You submit that as part of your original documents when you submit your feasibility studies, part of your...
it's part of the ESIA generally. You do a conceptual one, and then what you should be doing as your mine as a whole progresses, so should the closure plan progress. You know, if you've done progressive remediation of your tailings dam, that's something you've finished. So you just keep updating your closure plan. So it's not, well, that's what you should be doing. But then it's not quite so onerous when you have to put it together.
And you have to put in the funds annually. So you build in your funds for the final closure. You put in the funds annually so that you build on the funds. So when you do the closure, you should have the funds.
Yeah, part of the Cyanide Code, and it's a general thing with the mining industry. I think that I mean, you have to put a bond in place to say if you go in liquidation or it needs to close early or whatever, to actually be able to remediate that site, and it needs to be a ring-fenced amount of money, but it equally needs to go up as inflation goes up, or as your mine gets bigger, it needs to be a bigger input. So that's something that the code does ask for, but equally it's an important thing for your whole mining company or your mine itself anyway.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I think we're just about at the end of our time, and wonderful and very excellent presentation, very informative. We learned a lot about this poison, which is not only is actual in mine site, but it's all around. So thank you again. I'd now like to turn it over to Ian for our closing remarks. Ian?
Joey, must I say you have done another excellent job as the MC, and we look forward to you furthering your participation with Philippine Mining Club. Christine, great presentation. Enjoyed it. Oh, very informative.
Thank you.
And very enlightening, actually. I've learned a lot from what you've presented today. And we appreciate your time, the fact that you have got up early in the morning, and we hope that you have a very good Friday and a successful day.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Now, Philippine Mining Club, wow, the 11th of February, we have a very good presentation by Mr. David Way. David is the Executive General Manager for Oceana Corporation for New Zealand and the Philippines. Oceana's had, well, quite a colourful history over the last 12 months, and we certainly look forward to listening to what David is going to present to us. Following that, for the Philippine Infrastructure and Construction Club, we have on the 4th of March a presentation by Roberto Jose Castillo, who is the President and CEO of EEI Corporation. EEIO Corporation is one of the leading construction companies in the Philippines. So we certainly look forward to that presentation. On the 25th of March, we have another presentation by S&P Global Market Intelligence. At this stage, we do not know what the topic is, but I'm sure it's going to be exciting and one that we should all be attuned to. On the 29th of April, we have Ian Fraser, the CEO for Asia Pacific GHD. So in the next 2 months, we have some very interesting topics and interesting presentations that we're all looking forward to. And may I say that throughout this coming 2022, we will have additional webinars, and we'll have some very exciting presentations by some certainly leading industry people. Now, as Joey has already said, those who want to get a certificate of attendance for this presentation, just make your comments or your request to Joanne. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today, and we look forward to your attendance at our next presentation coming up very shortly on the 11th of February. And what I'd like you to do is to all turn your cameras on, because our maestro